I'm Trevor Phillips. This is Common Ground. In a world of conflict and division, all too many believe that if you're not with us, you must be against us. But does every problem have to be solved by the loudest voices or the biggest armies? Tonight,
through the public order bill that I will be bringing forward, we will see new criminal offences for those disruptive protesters that really bring our country to a grinding halt.
In the Queen's speech, the government pledges to curb disruptive protests, even if they're non-violent. Ministers say that people who block the highways and glue themselves to gates aren't heroes, they're extremist nuisances who stop law-abiding folk getting to work. Activists, like those who protest under the banner of Extinction Rebellion, retort that the fate of humanity is at stake and that, like the civil rights or anti-apartheid movements, their cause transcends any degree of day-to-day inconvenience. The environmental movement itself is split. Some activists fear that the tactics of groups like Insulate Britain or Just Stop Oil are turning off the public, provoking a political backlash and setting back half a century of progress. But many eco-warriors insist that change never comes without conflict, and their fight for climate justice, even if it lands them in jail, will see them on the right side of history. Our choice. Are climate protesters justified in disrupting society, or are they killing their own cause? In the next 60 minutes, two passionate believers come head-to-head in the search for common ground. With me tonight, Clare Farrell, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and Zion Lights, founder of the climate campaign group Emergency Reactor. Let's start preparing the ground and find out a bit more about our two guests and what they believe. And if I can start with you, Zion, what's your case against the methods being deployed by Extinction Rebellion and similar groups?
I'm not against using civil disobedience in general. I think it absolutely has a place, and the Extinction Rebellion has used it very well, particularly in moving the needle on where the discussions are around climate change. I was talking about climate change for many years before they came on the scene, and that's why I was happy to get involved, because they really shifted that, and that's amazing, and they've done a brilliant job. But I think now that people turning against these protests is worrisome. I find the policing bill worrisome. I don't think that our rights should be eroded. I think that the right to protest is a cornerstone of British democracy. And although I'm not putting that specifically on these groups, because I think that they have a really just cause, there was a YouGov poll last month that showed that 65% of Britain support the policing bill measures, and that really worries me. And I think actually we need to have tactics that bring ordinary working people along with these arguments so that they don't just turn against climate action because their day has been disrupted. You
yourself were one of the spokespeople, a leader in Extinction Rebellion. What made you fall out of love?
I was a spokesperson and I helped in the media team to found a newspaper. And the reason for that was because I believe we should try to reach different people and have conversations with people who aren't traditionally interested in environmental issues. The reason I shifted my perspective was because I felt that certain things were turning people off. And I think the turning point for me came around the Canning Town actions, which became a little bit violent and, again, really disrupted...
This is where people got on top of a train at the Canning Town station in London. Yeah,
and I was very vocal about that in the groups, and there was a split there where some people disagreed and some people said it's really necessary. But I just think that if it's turning away ordinary people, these are, people who are struggling to put food on the table, struggling with their energy bills. I've been in this environmental movement for about 20 years, and I think we've not appealed to those groups for a long time, and we really have to change that. We have to get everyone on board with climate action.
OK. Clare Farrell, I don't think there's any question that some of the tactics involve disruption and law-breaking. What is the case for that?
Well, as you've already pointed out, there's this enormous, I would say, noble and long tradition of non-violence and civil disobedience causing rapid and just change. So people fighting for justice have used this many, many times, these kinds of tactics. You would think that the sort of projected collapse of civilization, which is what is going to happen on the course that we're on right now, would be a serious enough cause for people to be able to, unite against leaders who are intentionally, apparently, leading them off a cliff. And the policing bill and the measures that are being brought in are, as I think David Lammy spoke very well in Parliament last year, really because the government are either too stupid or too cowardly to respond appropriately to the crises that they are being asked to deal with as leaders. And so the dereliction of leadership, which has been pointed out by Antonio Guterres, in his recent speech after the last IPCC report came out, the subtext of the message that he said was basically, ordinary people of the world, it's over to you.
All right. Look, we're going to unpack some of that, but let me just ask, in a way, the same question that I've asked Leon. Why does this matter to you personally so much? You put yourself in a position to be arrested. In fact, you have been arrested, I think, more than once. Why do you personally feel so passionately about this?
I don't really understand why everyone doesn't. I can't, morally, I can't exist in a world which is going to collapse around my nephews, my goddaughter, and all the young people in the world. I can't sit by whilst people in Pakistan and India are dying because of the heat, whilst there's enormous flooding taking place that's taking hundreds and thousands of lives all over the world. We're already in a state of breakdown. It's not like we're raising an alarm. It's like we're here saying, guys, it's actually already too late. So the least we could do is slam the brakes on and try to make it less worse. But that's the reality of the situation we're in. So it's not really for me a question of why do I care so much. It's more extraordinary to me, why isn't everybody out on the streets with us when it's so clear that people in leadership in politics and business are intentionally continuing to make this worse, not better?
Both of you clearly agree that this is, I think you would both say that this is probably the #1 issue of our time, right? Zion, if it is such a big issue, is it not big enough that it merits disregard both for the existing law and popular opinion? I mean, that's a truth of all ages, that some people think that some things are so important that you have to break through the framework of law and custom of the time to prosecute that particular cause.
Well, let me pick apart the question a little bit. The suffragettes are often cited as, a prime example of they used civil disobedience, they achieved their aims, absolutely brilliant, fantastic. It took them over 100 years. We don't have that time right now. We don't have that time, and people in Extinction Rebellion would agree we don't have that time. And my concern is that 15 years ago, I was arrested twice for climate action. Once protesting a coal-fired power station, once protesting tar sands. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm kind of saying, I don't think that it's working in the way that we want it to work. It has worked to a degree, in that it really, the April Rebellion, I got involved in the beginning, that brought a lot of people on side. It felt like a really pivotal moment. People were suddenly very concerned. It was all over the media. That was all thanks to Extinction Rebellion and their work, and it was very successful. But then the tide has shifted, and actually, one thing that happened is that 75% of Britons then, in that kind of year of Extinction Rebellion existing, they became very concerned about climate change and the environment. That was new, and that has stayed consistent even through the pandemic. So that work has been done. But now we need to lead people to solutions. This is why I started a group to fight for solutions, because I fear that that's being lost in just pushing the same message again and again and again,
okay.
which is spreading fear.
We're going to go through all of that bit by bit. Just very quickly to you, Claire. You accept that there's a scientific basis for the argument around climate change. You would accept what the IPCC or the World Meteorological Organization say. You accept the science, that there's science here.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the main drivers for a lot of people in taking action. But I would say that what's really important when you're thinking about the science as a lens and what gets called the science is that I believe we've been using the wrong intellectual framework to look at this problem, because it's not purely a problem of science, and it's not even purely a problem of politics, but it is a problem which involves risk. And no risk analyst would ever look at the collapse of your home and say it's OK to give you a 50-50 chance. You wouldn't build a bridge if there was more than a tiny, minute percentage chance of any harm coming to somebody who goes onto that bridge. We don't build those things. But for some reason, because the scientific discipline has been the only lens that we've used to look at climate, people have said, well, there's a 20% chance that we will make 1.5, or there's actually, right now, there's a 0% chance we're going to make 1.5, by the way. But, you know, using a risk analysis lens would be a much more useful intellectual framework to take. And, of course, then that throws into stark relief the political problem, which is that we can see quite clearly in this country our politicians are incapable of looking at the world through a risk lens and making smart decisions, you know.
All right. OK, well, that's very interesting. I want to come back to that, that actually even small risks are worth trying to avoid. Let's just start to unpack each of your cases. Now, if I may start with you, Zion. I guess that the main question that might be put it to your position is very simple, that the sort of reformism, the persuasion, the case for persuasion that you're making, that we've got to take the public with us and all of that, just isn't working. COP26, some people, I would say it was all right, but nobody thought it was a stupendous success. Today, the World Meteorological Organization says that we are almost certain to see a 1.5% rise in world surface temperature over the pre-industrial levels in the next 5 years. And I'm going to read you what the IPCC say is going to happen. Once-in-a-century floods happening every year. Major cities in South Asia and the Middle East experiencing lethal heat for at least 200 days a year. Total loss of coral reefs. Irreversible acceleration in sea level rises as the ice caps melt. So we might, we might all take everybody along with us. We might do things in a democratic way, but we're all going to drown together in a nice democratic way.
I mean, I've been talking about this for, you don't have to convince me. I completely agree. What I'm saying is that the tactics that I was involved in 15 years ago are still being used today. And at some point we have to go, do we need to reassess this? Because it isn't working. It worked in that it's created a shift and people are now talking about it. But is it working in the action we need to see? There's change that we need to see. I don't believe that it is. And that's where I think, we need to look at what messaging we're pushing and how effective that is. For example, scaring a lot of people about the issue. OK, fine, we've kind of done that. Children are very worried. There's high degrees of eco-anxiety among kids. But is that helping them to build the resilience that they need to live in this world? Right, this is the world that they're going to have to adapt to. Shouldn't we be talking about solutions and mitigation and all of the science and all of the things that are still at our disposal? Yes, it is too late for some things, but it's not too late to, we shouldn't completely give up. I mean, I think we're in agreement about that. But then we need to look at what the solutions are and push for those to be implemented. And somewhere like here where we live in a democracy, yes, I have plenty of issues with this government, but we do live in a democracy where we can push for the solutions. And what I see is that there's not a lot of that happening. There's just not a lot of that happening. We just keep pushing the same messaging, be afraid about climate change. And then we say, why aren't people more worried about it? People are worried about putting food on the table. People are worried about getting their kids to school on time because you blocked a road. Yes, we can't bring everybody on board. But what I'm saying is I've watched for 15 years as those people have not been brought on board, and now 65% of them are saying, yeah, we support these policing bills. That's worrying to me. And that should be worrying to all of us.
Claire, your tactics are leaving the majority of people behind.
Well, I don't agree. And, to go back to Canning Town, for example, I did a lot of interviews that day. Very few people, unsurprisingly, wanted to be the face of XR that day and go on the news. And, what I tried to draw people's attention to was that this is just one action which, unfortunately, didn't go as well as planned. I think there were mistakes made about choosing that station. It was
disastrous in public relations terms.
Well, maybe, but it also spread much further than any other action we've ever done, right? So that's another question. It was on the front page in other countries. The news here doesn't follow anything unless it's dramatic, novel. We have to do extraordinary amount of work to pander to a media which has also performed an abject dereliction of duty in terms of informing the public about the crisis and the danger that they're actually really in. But just to speak about that action, people don't know that many other actions where people climbed on trains, glued themselves to trains, have been through the court system, they've been in front of a jury in a Crown Court, and they've been acquitted because the jury don't think that campaigning to try and stop the breakdown of civilised life is disproportionate to delaying a train for about 70 minutes. So it was unfortunate that those people had that experience on that train platform. They were found guilty and they were sentenced with some punishment. But every other person who did exactly the same thing has been acquitted in a court. Now, that goes along with other cases of ours which are going through the court system where they're also being acquitted by juries. And so, for me, that shows that this policing bill and the approach of this government is entirely out of step with what the public's actual reaction is when they're faced with the question of justice and this movement.
Dion, there's an interesting point there, isn't there? That actually, as you say, you said a couple of times, you've been making this case for 15 years. Had it not been for some of what people would describe as more extreme actions of some activists, nobody would have noticed.
But I'm not disagreeing with that, and I was, involved in some of these actions myself.
Indeed.
But I have also given figures from a YouGov poll that was from last month, that I urge people to look it up, that found that 65% of the British public support the bill. That worries me. It worries me that we not only have a policing bill, but an elections bill and a nationality and borders bill that is stripping away the rights of British people, and they don't even realise this has never happened before in my lifetime. This is very worrying. Why is that much control being exerted over our citizens?
But stopping Claire climbing on a train isn't going to change Priti Patel's mind about this, is it?
Claire can climb wherever she likes. That's not my concern. My concern is that if you're not taking ordinary working people along with you, then, look, it's become very polarised. Let's strip it back for a second. It's almost as if you don't sit in a road now, you don't care about climate change. That's my concern. There has to be space for everybody in this movement. Not everybody has a house where they own it and they can put solar panels on it and they can have an EV and heat pumps. They are struggling to put food on the table. And you see it play out in things like Canning Town, and you see it play out, yes, the judge and the jury who don't have to worry about those things are very supportive. But if you look at just what ordinary people are saying or what the polls are saying, a lot of ordinary people are just getting very angry about it. And it worries me because I think that could set us back quite a long way. And we don't have time for that. We need to get lots of people on board. We need to talk about, for example, we can talk about solutions like, I think insulated homes.
We will come on to solutions, but I just want to be clear about tactics. Are you saying that XR should just stop all this gluing and handcuffing and climbing on stuff, or not?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Oh, you think it's OK for them to break the law?
I think that stripping away our right to protest is chilling and should not happen. It is part of our history. It is part of British legacy. We hardly ever have positive change without these movements. Absolutely, people should have the right to protest. At the same time, these people are very aware that they might go to jail, so even actually stricter laws are not going to deter them anyway. So the people who are making these laws don't understand the reasons, which are driven by integrity and passion and fear about the planet, that those are real reasons and they're not going to go away just because you lock them up. So it's completely wrong anyway. All I'm saying is that if you look at the history of how long we've been doing this in the environmental movement, it is not making enough shifts, it is not bringing enough people along. And I've heard this said by people in Extinction Rebellion to me, we don't need to bring everyone along, Zion. And that's where I disagree. There are ways of protesting that aren't just disrupting people. Look at things like in France where they blocked the tube stations. And people could go, they could travel for free. This is supporting public transport. This is getting people on board. That's very clever tactics. It's not sit in a road or you don't care. There are lots of different ways of campaigning. And I just think it's worth exploring those different ways of campaigning and trying to choose the things that are...
Before we talk about the menu of campaigning, just wanted to get one thing clear with you, Claire. You've referred a couple of times to the proposals that the government's making on the Public Order Bill. If those changes are brought in and go through Parliament, will that stop you taking the sort of action that you and your colleagues have taken in the past, which would involve, gluing yourself to bits of the infrastructure and so on?
Well, I think there's enormous power in our movement, which is not going to be deterred by this stuff, because, as you say, the movement was set up to say we will peacefully break the law. So writing new laws to stop it is kind of funny, right? But at the same time...
So your message to Priti Patel is knock yourself out, pass your laws.
Well,
it's not going to make any difference.
The problem with this is that, it's also impacting a lot of people in very different ways. So you can look at the Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities who've just had their way of life made illegal, basically. And at the same time, you know, the destruction of people's rights to protest, at the same time threatening to deport people just for having dual nationality to a country perhaps where they've never even been in their life. You know, it's an extraordinary assault on democracy, which has taken place in the mother of all democracies, where they're basically strangling it in front of everyone's eyes. And I would say, just on Zion's point, that, like, the public aren't are in favour of this policing bill stuff. I think the public are being enormously polarised and guided by a disgraceful media campaign to smear activists, to enrage people. If you saw the TV show yesterday where the mum who drove into the protesters with her SUV meets Tracy Mulligan from Insulate Britain, and they have a really beautiful conversation on a morning TV show just the other day, because they are actually in agreement about everything. So the media whips that violence up against protesters, and that is very unsafe for people trying to do that work, you know. OK, well, nobody from the government is here to explain their position. We'll take a break now, because we've been hearing quite a lot of what Zion thinks. And I want to turn in a moment to examine a bit more closely what you've been saying, Claire. We'll be back in a few moments.
We've got post-Brexit challenges, we've got post-COVID challenges, we've got customers that have been told to stay at home for the last 2 years, who need to get back into the habit of coming out and enjoying our world-class live music scene. And then, of course, we're running slap bang into a cost of living crisis, which is putting huge pressure on disposable income. I'd say it's threefold. First of all, you know, the government did a very effective job of telling people to stay at home for 2 years. Let's tell people to get out and enjoy everything we have. You know, the Stones might be the most high-profile example of the strange market we have at the moment for tickets, but the vast majority of gigs and festivals are independently owned, the small businesses, and we want people to get out there and enjoy them. Then secondly, you know, we believe there should be a cultural rate for VAT on ticket sales that would bring us in line with many other countries around the world. We've just had VAT go back up to 20%. We think it should be more around about the 5% mark. And then really fundamentally, it's about, you know, can we be putting money back into household budgets to spare to go out to gigs? Because as I said, that money goes to independent venues, which then goes right back into the local economy. And people buying tickets for gigs also support local hairdressers, local boutiques, right the way through to the taxi at the end of the night.
Con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat.
This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Clare Farrell, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and Zion Light, founder of the climate campaign group Emergency Reactor. We're talking about whether climate protesters have got it wrong. Clare Farrell, we've been talking about the issue of public support. Is there a danger that you are overstating the case and alienating possible supporters? For example, do you really believe that we are experiencing, I'm quoting here from the XR website, your biography, corporate state planned mass murder? Do you really believe that?
Yes, I do. Because the people in power know very well the situation. They understand what's taking place. They understand what needs to be done about it. And for example, take this, government leading the COP process in Glasgow. Our leaders are in tears, saying that they are concerned they've failed humanity, that the children all around the world are going to suffer, that people are already suffering these impacts. And within a matter of months, they're licensing for new oil and gas out of the North Sea, when they know that we need to stop taking fossil fuels out of the ground. I mean,
they may be making mistakes, but
that is not a mistake. That's not a mistake.
Murder.
That is not a mistake. That is an intentional decision to make something that is irreversible and catastrophic worse and more guaranteed, and to do so via policy decisions which only a few months previous you wouldn't have dared to say because you were crying on the national media about your fear for the future in light of climate change. The problem here is that there's no coherence. People can't hold the reality. It's like a hyper-object, the climate, right? It's complicated, it's scary, it's difficult to tackle. But on some fronts, we know precisely what needs to be done. And we know the people who've caused it, and we know the people who've lied to the public, and we know the campaigns that they've done in the fossil fuel sector to mislead the media, the public, and the politicians. They did it for decades. They've done it for well over a generation. And we've lost that time, and we can never get it back. And the people who are in power today need to grow up and accept their responsibility and the context that they are in, because history will judge them for what they do now. And opening new oil and gas right now, as the president of the COP process globally, is one of the most offensive and disgusting acts that this government could ever have done. And the public should be rightly outraged, and they're struggling in a crisis for the cost of living. They're struggling with an energy crisis. People are worried about the war in Ukraine. Yes, these things are very important, but this is this looming, enormous prospect of the breakdown of our biosphere, which people have to take seriously. And if they refuse to, yes, I do think it's mass murder.
Zion, it's quite a charge, and I suppose it follows that your, let's put it this way, softy approach is letting mass murderers off the hook. I
mean, I campaign for clean energy, so I completely agree that we should keep fossil fuels in the ground, but I've been saying that for a long time and it hasn't changed anything, and gluing myself to stuff hasn't changed anything. So now I work with the Emergency Reactor, trying to educate the public, trying to talk to people about clean energy, trying to encourage politicians to make...
By clean energy, by the way, you mean nuclear
and renewables,
power.
But I find most people already support renewables, so nuclear energy is the difficult thing which I've chosen to tackle. And actually, these environmental groups need to make up their mind, because they say follow the science, but they reject nuclear energy. When I came out supporting nuclear energy, which was quite a difficult thing to do as a long-term environmentalist, I was heavily attacked, including by leading spokespeople in Extinction Rebellion. If you say follow the science, follow what the IPCC says, which is that we need renewables and nuclear to decarbonise. It's as simple as that. And secondly, you can't have it all. We have to get our energy from somewhere. So absolutely, let's get rid of fossil fuels, but then fight for the solutions as well.
I'm going to come back to you, Claire, on that specific point, but you didn't really answer my question about the phrase that Claire used.
Is it mass murder? Is that what you're asking me? I wouldn't use that phrase. People are dying, though, and people will continue to die. But, I mean, 2 billion people live in poverty. People already are dying. It's an apocalyptic world in many ways already. Are we making it worse? Absolutely, yes. There are heat waves in India right now that are killing people, and it's barely on the news. I would like to see these issues discussed more. I worry that when there's a protest and it gets attention, it becomes all about the protest and not about what's actually happening in the world. I don't know how we deal with that. That's a media issue. And I find campaigning with my group, because we don't do these kind of strong actions where we're blocking roads and things, it's very hard to get anyone to listen and talk about things. And actually, that's where I'd say use those platforms to talk about solutions, because people aren't aware of what they are.
Claire, are you one of the XR leaders who would criticise Zion for promoting what she describes as clean energy, part of which would be nuclear reactors?
I've not really got a strong opinion about nuclear on the basis that I haven't done the depth of research that I would like to do to be able to say, here's what I think, this is what I'm fighting for. My understanding from other people who I know who are very passionate about it is that it's too late because it takes a long time to build them. We need to decarbonise much more quickly than that. There are many arguments, if you think that you face the collapse of civilization, that nuclear reactors can pose a future risk, those kinds of things. Those are the conversations I hear, but I'm not here to say yes or no to nuclear or yes or no to different forms of energy. As you probably know, Trevor, we have a demand in XR for participative politics, so we think people should be able to be included in the democratic process to decide the way forwards. And so you would, gather the evidence, gather the people, and examine that.
You said you're not here to say yes or no on energy, but did you not just make a huge case for leaving oil and gas behind?
Yeah, but I think then you have to have a participatory process to decide how you deal with the situation from there.
But how is that following the science? If the reports are already out showing how we need to decarbonise, how is that following the science? You said earlier that that's what we should be doing, right?
I don't
if you're asking people to just make the decisions.
Questions, Zion.
Well, I think what Zion is saying is you've got a clear view about fossil fuels, oil and gas. Yeah. How come you don't have a similar view about the other possibilities that might help to stave off the crisis that you've talked about?
Well, because we want people to be able to be included in a process where they decide. We don't want to be a movement that goes around telling people what should happen. We want people to be able to be brought together into a political environment where they sit around tables together and deliberate in a grown-up way rather than the combative politics of Westminster with, like, posh people arguing over an old box. We want real people to sit around tables and have real grown-up conversations about what needs to happen. And yes, it's going to be complicated to work out the future of energy policy. So I'm not here to say that I know the answers to that because I think it's extremely complex. But what we have been told in no uncertain terms is that there should be no new oil and gas. And that's not just from campaigners like us. It's from the International Energy Agency, which is hardly like a bastion of radicalism in the world, is it? And they said last year, no new licences from 2021. Okay.
And the International Energy Agency also says we need renewables and nuclear to decarbonise, as does the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations report. So all of that is really important. And the fact that, you're sitting there saying you didn't know this, that's what I'm trying to say is if you're not telling people what the solutions are and bringing them along with you, you're just saying, stop doing this, stop doing that. And that's very difficult for people to accept. I know it shouldn't be. I know they should be aware and passionate about the issues like you are. But that message isn't getting through. It's just not getting through.
OK. Coming up, we've been hearing what both of our guests think about each other's case. We're going to start looking in earnest for some common ground. Back in a moment. Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Clare Farrell, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and Zion Lights, founder of the climate campaign group Emergency Reactor. We're talking about whether climate protesters have got it wrong. And we found out some of what our guests think and why. Now, let's see if we can find some common ground, or at least a common understanding between our two guests. Clare, how do you respond to the accusation that XR is itself a bit of an exclusive movement?
Well, first of all, we've had a lot of accusations of this nature thrown at the movement, which I think, firstly, for people to describe it as white and middle class routinely erases the taking part of people of colour, of people from different class backgrounds, of people with different abilities, people from what you would term, minority groups or marginalised groups in society. There are a lot of people who fit that definition in our movement. And I think that they're overlooked and then erased by these kind of things sometimes when they're slung at us, which I think is deeply unfair and deeply unhelpful, frankly. There's always massive amount of work to do, of course, to try and broaden the movement, to try and reach more people. But having a lot of people organising around their own kind of work identity, in a way. We've had a lot of people coming out because they're scientists, because they're teachers, because they're doctors, because they're lawyers, because they are students, because they are people of colour, because they are young people, because they are grandparents, because, the list goes on, right, in terms of, like, community groups that find themselves working together, people of multiple faith groups, this kind of thing. So, it's actually a very broad movement. I would invite anyone who thinks that it's an exclusive space which only has one type of person in it, to come and to meet some people from Extinction Rebellion and realise, hopefully, that it is not. And also that there's a really diverse array of activities. It's not just people gluing themselves to things. There's lots of family events, there's lots of outreach, there's lots of different stuff that happens under the banner of XR, you know?
Zion, do you accept that?
I didn't make that argument that you made. It has some diversity in there. I think there are some issues, especially with the focus on arrest as a form of protest. I think that turns a lot of people off. I understand that the idea is to, you know, normalise that and to get more people involved so that they are willing to risk arrest and fill the jails. I understand all of that. I just think it's quite polarising. It's not going to appeal to a lot of people. I know that that's a significant disagreement that I have with the group that I also had when I was in the group. But what I would say is that I just don't think the polarisation is very helpful. And actually, Claire brought this up earlier where she said, look, when this lady in the 4x4 actually spoke to the person, they got along and they had things in common. But when one person was blocking the road and the other one was trying to get her kid to school on time, that was very polarising. We all saw how that played out and it was very negative. All I'm saying is there a way to communicate and to still protest and push the envelope, but not in such a polarising way, because that is then what people see and often what they end up taking away, which actually can just be really detrimental to the cause, which we all care about, which is effective climate action.
But, well, Claire, what's your response to that, that actually we don't need it? We don't need these dramatic exhibitions and these protests which inconvenience people, that there may be easier ways to persuade people?
Well, I mean, we've built an extremely successful global movement off the back of these kinds of tactics, and precisely partly for the reason that when you cause disruption, when you make a big noise, when you get a lot of press, when people are paying attention to what you're saying, they learn about the thing that you're saying. And so there's lots of people in our movement who joined precisely because they came across a road blockage, because they saw it on the news, because it was disruptive, because it was interesting, because there was drama, because it started a big conversation. And so this situation, as I said, is not getting better, it's actively getting worse, and the policies that are being written are actively making it worse. So when you are living in a context that your political system and your political reality is cementing the guarantee of the breakdown of our food systems, of the breakdown of biodiversity to a scale which we'll really struggle to recover from, you know, extreme weather events that are going to get more and more often, like the stats that you read out earlier. You know, there's going to be a devastating amount of loss of life in the future, and it's already happening now today all over the world. So, you know, yes, does it deserve a response which brings the drama into people's minds about what this really means? Yes, I think it really does. And of course, we're not the only game in town. So Zion's free to do her campaigning the way she wants to do it. Other people can do campaigning the way they want to do it. It's not like we're the only people that do anything about climate. It's just that we do our thing and we recognise our space as part of we're part of an ecology of like an entire climate movement. And we just do a thing that we do. Other people set up to do things in a different way. And I think everyone has to work together to push in the same direction to build the strength, because it's true, like everyone won't do the things that I do or the things that other people in XR do, but that doesn't make them unhelpful.
OK.
So can I clarify, because of the way you asked the question, I wasn't saying these protests shouldn't happen. I'm simply questioning who they're targeting, who they're disrupting, and what the tactics are. And I think those could be shifted to something like what we said earlier about the Gilets jaunes. There are ways of doing things that are still disruptive, but they bring people on board as well. It's still civil disobedience. I'm not saying that we should just give all that up, and I think that that should not be made illegal. Absolutely not. But there comes a point where you have to think, all right, maybe, yeah, the media has fed it as well, and people are turning against this movement, but then we have to think, how do we get those people back? Because these changes will not be enacted unless we bring those people with us.
So you're both on the same place, I think, on the public order bill as proposed, as if I understand it correctly, Zion, you would be against what is being proposed at the front. So one piece of common ground, and let's be clear, nobody from the government is here to defend them, but everybody here, not me, obviously, I'm nobody. The two of you are basically against what the government has in mind. Now, that's the easy bit. You both also seem to think that there is there can be a movement which has all sorts in it. But let's delve into that a little bit more deeply. Are you saying, Zion, that it doesn't matter to you that some of the actions, not necessarily Clare herself, but some of the people on that wing of the movement, which do alienate some people, that, as far as you're concerned, though you wouldn't do it yourself, it's just part of what has to happen, and you would tolerate that? Not that you're against it; it's just one of the things that happens. But you'd like us to, the media, for example, to focus on other things.
Well, this is a thing, though. I understand it's one movement. I understand that it's doing a very specific thing, but it then sucks up all the air. All the air goes over there. I'm doing events as well, but because they are not hugely disruptive or, you know, mass kind of campaigns to, I don't know, people shouting at us in roads, we're not getting the platform to talk about the science and solutions. And there should be different voices. I'm not necessarily putting that on Extinction Rebellion. That is a media issue. That is what they're likely to cover. But it is sucking the air out of other parts of the
Here's
movement.
a point, Clare, that actually, in principle, what you do might not be wrong, but in reality, what you're doing is you're essentially sucking the oxygen out of Zion's wing of the movement and not allowing anybody to listen to her.
Well, I mean, I just don't think that's true. You know, what Zion's just said is basically that people don't pay attention to her campaign because she doesn't do anything disruptive. That's what we're here to talk about. Does disruption work? Yes. We're getting more attention. Is she struggling for attention? Yes. Do something disruptive then. Do you know what I mean? Like that seems to me the answer's there. Like it's what works to raise the profile of an issue.
But I've done the disruptive. But the reason I stopped doing the disruptive things is because it wasn't bringing people along. So I'm trying to do the things that bring people along. I feel like there could be some meshing here of what we're both trying to achieve, where we go, well, you know, we have different approaches. Like you said, we need to work together. We're not actually. You're kind of going, well, we do our thing and you do your thing. That is not going to succeed. And I knew that 15 years ago, and I still know that now. It's not going to succeed. We have to get people on board. We have to get politicians on board. I know you hate them, but we have to get them on board. And we are not appealing to them. We are not appealing to groups that are outside of our little pocket where we really believe these things, we understand these things. And we can't just keep saying, why don't they understand over there? That's our job, right, to communicate that. I do a lot of communication and risk communication. It doesn't really get much press coverage. That's fine, it doesn't have to, but then it's not getting the reach that you get when you climb on a train. And that is very polarising, and it does turn some people off, and it does then become about, was the action okay or wasn't it okay, and now it's going to be banned, and all of that, where actually people are dying right now through heat waves driven by climate change. No one's talking about it.
Clare, Zion's perhaps being polite about this, but I suspect that some people who think like her would say the reason we're getting this police bill that you all hate is because you guys do such unreasonable things that people who would otherwise support your cause want to stop you blocking up the roads and preventing them going to work. And if you could just listen to what this reasonable person says, then we might be a bit more sympathetic.
Well, firstly, let's not lose context, right? We're facing the breakdown of everything that supports civilised life on Earth, right? That is a fact. The IPCC is saying it. Everyone agrees, right? So that is a pretty enormous issue, if you might say, injustice, for people to be taking action against. And it is said, you know, that citizens are the conscience keepers of a democratic society. Now, within European Charter of Human Rights, within the laws in this country, we have a right to do disruptive protest. And the policing bill is going to clash with our rights as citizens, with our human rights. I don't know what the government are planning to write into the new Bill of UK rights, but the point is we have a right to do this kind of disruption, and people should be asking themselves, what on earth is it that's so bad that causes these doctors, lawyers, teachers to be doing this extraordinary work, putting themselves at risk, risking losing their careers, risking problems that might cause with their work, with their family, and all kinds of other issues with travel, you know, having a criminal record? What is it that's making so many people do that? And actually, the thing that's making people do that is fearing for the future of civilised life. Is that not, you know, I can't understand why this is such a, difficult thing for people to get their heads around.
All right.
If we make a rational and sane response to this crisis and start to deal with it, everybody will get on board and start doing the hard work of making things better again. Do you know what I mean? But you can't do that without a massive shift. And at the moment, politicians are blocking action that the public want. The public resoundingly want climate action fast.
All right. Well, we're coming to a point where somebody's got to make a decision about something. We'll go to a break, and after that, I'm going to ask you both to respond to what you've heard and see if there is actually any prospect for common ground between the two of you. And by the way, I will give my view. Stay with us. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Clare Farrell, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and Zion Lights, founder of the climate campaign group Emergency Reactor. We've been talking about whether climate protesters have got it wrong. We're coming to the end of our programme now, so I'm going to give each of you a minute to tell me what you feel you've learned from our conversation and if anything you've heard has actually changed your mind about the other view. Zion.
I actually think Claire and I do agree on a lot of things, and even the point that she made about, you know, why don't people care? I keep doing things, they're not listening. I keep ringing the alarm, they're not responding. I think quite a lot of us feel like that. For me, it's just led me to a different path because I've said, OK, well, maybe I should try something different because I keep doing these things and they're not making a difference. Whereas what I feel I'm doing now, it might not get as much media attention, but it's engaging people on quite a basic level, talking about risk perception, talking about solutions. That feels to me much more powerful and, you know, change-bringing than anything I've done, including gluing myself to things and shutting down banks or investing in fossil fuels and all the many, many things that I've done over the years. What I would say as well is that it seems to me that it's become a very normal thing now to glue onto something or sit in a road. It used to be a very radical idea. I think now the radical idea that I would push is engage with the democracy that we have, engage with the politicians, hold the line and try and make things better, not just in things like the policing bill, but all of the things that we've mentioned where our rights are being eroded, because all of that is relevant to climate action and the way that populations are or not controlled through the changes that we're going to face.
OK. Claire?
Yeah, well, I think me and Zion do agree on quite a lot of things, especially around climate and the rapidity with which things need to happen. You know, the fact that we've sort of normalised civil disobedience, we've had these thousands of scientists recently going out and taking arrestable action. The same thing goes for healthcare workers. The same thing you're hearing from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of the UN, saying the true radicals are the governments that are still extracting fossil fuels and expanding that industry. The true radicals are the industry players who are trying to make sure that fossil fuels don't stay in the ground and that we continue pulling those out. I mean, I feel like the growth of the movement does show that, you know, with new movements like Just Stop Oil, lots of youth-led movements, there's loads of direct action that's going on around the world. There's people in Australia, in Canada, all over Europe, these groups that are popping up that are using more disruptive tactics where people are willing to take more personal risk. You know, I do think that we're still some way away from a social tipping point where acting on climate very, very quickly becomes an inevitability rather than something that people are striving for. But we don't know where those social tipping points are. I still think that we're worth carrying on trying to find them because I don't think that it's impossible to meet that, but we need a bigger movement. OK, well, this has been incredibly illuminating for me. I mean, look, obviously there's common ground. You both agree on the urgency of the cause. You both agree about scale. And I should, full disclosure, say that, of course, before the dawn of time, as a young activist, I engaged in some activities, anti-apartheid and so on, that did get me carted away by the cops. So, and you both agree that actually there's a place for that. Where I think you haven't persuaded each other is really about the public and to what extent they are ready to listen. You think that they still need a bit more prodding. You think that there may be better and easier ways of getting them to listen. So I think we've got 80% of the way there, but the 20%, which is about human nature, I guess, is still out there. But quite a lot of common ground tonight. Thank you both very much. That's it from us. See you again next week.